Now, as intermediate learners, we need to understand that one of the most important foundation skills in Yiquan is using what Wang Shengjai calls rebound energy, or what in modern terms we call setting a posture. And that also implies understanding that footwork in Yiquan isn't just about positioning yourself relative to another person, it's about how you solidify your structure and help to transmit force to the hip point. Now, there's something else that I need from you as intermediate learners, and remember this idea of escalating the basics. Well, that also implies to the way that we learn. We need to learn multiple things in one go. We need to learn multiple things at a time in order to improve and increase the speed at which we're learning overall. So let's continue on thinking about split harmonies and thinking about some more details. And these details are going to be important because they become principles of the footwork in Yiquan. And the technique that we were looking at was a jab and then a step in split harmony cross. And remember that in this case, the split harmony begins with landing the foot relatively flat-footed. It's not completely flat-footed. A split harmony isn't always like this, but in this case it is. And then at the point that that foot lands, sets the posture, the technique hasn't been thrown. And this is called a split harmony because it's a variation of the idea in Xing Yiquan that the hand and fist should land together. And there's lots of nonsense written about harmonies in Xing Yiquan. In fact, it simply refers to rebound energy, setting a posture. And we've also learned that although diligent practice can help us to set postures in complex ways without really too much thought, it will become an intuitive skill and it's not that hard to get. Nevertheless, the theory of setting postures is perhaps a little bit more complicated than it seems at first. We also know, for example, in this case, that we have a split harmony and then a split second later, the posture sets again on the rear foot, the pivot root pushing forwards and pushing into the punch. And to help us learn all of this, we're using the idea of rhythm. So let's listen again to a slightly slower version of this posture and feel the rhythm. Quite how you time the posture doesn't really matter, as long as it's helpful for you in learning. For me, because this posture is slowed down, it's got a rhythm of 1 and 2, 3, 1 and 2, 3. And that's because I'm counting the drop back to guard after the first punch. Let's have a look. 1 and 2, 3, 1 and 2, 3, 1 and 2, 3, 1 and 2, 3. And of course the elements of our posture are basic. Open with the jab, then close with the cross. Open, down, and then look at this step here. And we also considered this idea, when we do it faster, it's not quite a crescent step, particularly the final part of the step. But when we step in towards our body, usually we bring our leg closer. And remember that we talked about how awkward it is to try and step with the legs open, like you're carrying a football between your legs. It makes the step almost impossible. So we usually bring the leg in closer, bring the thighs closer together on the step. Next, we need to think about the pivot root. And remember, how many times have I said, this comes intuitively. The foot needs to be pointing towards the hip point in most cases, but it also needs to take into account the step that you're about to do. And you can't always predict that, so it has to be a stochastic approach. But what we need to think about in this case is not lifting the initial pivot root too high. We're going to compound the movement and make the pivot root smaller so that it can flow more easily. It will have more structural sympathy with the next posture. And to complicate matters, all of this will become more difficult if you use a different posture on any of the techniques. A hook, for example, has a different pivot root to the jab. But let's leave that for the moment and it all comes naturally in the end. Now here from the side view you can see clearly the differences in the height of the different pivot roots. We don't want the full jab on its own height, we want about half a unit, half a pivot root unit if you like. And that then has a lot of structural sympathy with dropping all the weight and then just flowing forward with the crescent step into the next posture like that. Now remember, it's very tempting to land the second foot high on the ball of the foot with a high pivot root, but we don't want that for a split harmony in this case. So we need to be able to adapt our footwork. Sometimes we need to land on the ball of the foot, sometimes we need to land slightly more flat-footed like that. So look again, the different kinds of step. That's a very high landing. Switch, and that's much flatter, just landing on the ball of the foot. That's what we want, a flatter step. Now let's watch and listen to our overall posture done with more speed. Now, you'll remember from previous videos that the problem with stepping flat-footed is it makes it much more likely to be a slip risk. And also, a flat-footed step leans our weight a little bit more forwards. Compare that with a pivot root, which just pushes us back a little bit. Actually, there's no way to completely mitigate this, and sometimes you will slip. However, there's something else that we can do, and that's something that we did before, and it's to compound the movement. And that will work just in exactly the same way that we did it before, by pulling the lead foot back a little bit, sacrificing the distance in the step for the sake of the compound. So we won't cover as much ground, but we will get a faster, sharper, safer landing and overall movement. The difficulty is landing with the flatter footed landing, which is a lot harder than landing on the ball of the foot. It's a little bit of a knack that you've got to practice. We're still using a split harmony, and I'll do it slower, but still try and feel the timing. Now, a related consideration is the volume of the posture, in this case meaning simply how wide the legs are when we step. So what's our finishing posture? Look how narrow the posture is here. Remember from the beginner series, this is just 1 foot's width, so we can say 1 unit. And it creates this kind of posture on completion of the split harmony, in this case the cross. And you can see really clearly here why we call this closing of the quad close. You can see that this posture is close, which we usually associate with a cross. And remember, as we were just talking about, that when we do a step, we don't usually want to have this feeling like there's a football between our legs. So we bring the thighs closer together, and from that point we don't usually, if we're going to do a step, we don't usually want to step out too far. It makes the posture very awkward in its own way. Not only does it usually take too long to do that big step, it's also a slide risk if you step out quite wide to the side with a straightforward normal step. There's too much pressure, too much energy going out when you land the step. So we usually keep it narrow like this if it's a big step. Compare that with our next variation, which is to step out 1 more unit, so it's the width of 2 feet. And this is the posture you very often see in Yiquan, a wider step with the cross like this. And it's not just about positioning, it's about the kind of posture that you're doing and the way that you're setting the posture, and we'll see that much more clearly. And you'll be able to link it to some of the famous Yiquan people that you've seen doing this kind of posture. You'll understand why they're doing that as we move forwards. But to land this step safely, this big wider step, usually we don't do a normal step, we do like a skip step, the compounded step. From the side, you can see that you get more action around the vertical axis when you do a bigger step. It's just adding more volume into the posture. So you can do a slightly bigger Farley. Farley, it's a small movement, but within that space of, say, a foot's width, you can add more volume into the posture, get a little bit more power in it. That maximisation of power is very much why Yiquan masters of the past favoured that technique. They're going for a shorter fight with more power in the techniques and taking more risk. But there is another really useful, in fact, critically important and very powerful variation, and that's the pendulum cross. And this keeps all the postures quite narrow and moving straight forwards. You don't step out at all. You keep it as a much more linear step, much closer to Xing Yiquan, in fact. And I'll demonstrate that now with a jab cross jab moving forward version using pure harmonies rather than split harmonies. So listen and watch. And what you're seeing here is not just stepping, it's setting. It's stepping with setting. It's a little bit awkward looking at this stage because you wouldn't usually do a combination like this. You would add in postures on the half beats at a more advanced level. But breaking it down like this, you can see the difference between just stepping and stepping with setting and how that begins to affect how you move in each one. Now this is a much more Xing Yiquan type movement. It's very linear and therefore it has the same problem that you've got to be very careful about the step. Don't make it too narrow. It's always going to be a little bit off balance. All your energy is going forwards. It's not a very resilient structure. In fact, if you look carefully in a moment, you'll see that as I try and do it slowly, I go off balance. This is not the kind of posture that you can do slowly. It's dynamic, but the footwork is so close together, it's so awkward that it's incredibly vulnerable. It's something that you do very fast moving forwards, like Xing Yiquan, so that you're only in that vulnerable position for the shortest possible space of time. But that aside, the pendulum cross on its own is a fantastic technique, and you can do it wider than this anyway. Regardless of all of that, remember one of the big innovations in Yiquan compared to Xing Yiquan was adding volume. And that primarily happened so that you could use techniques that didn't rely on just moving all your body weight forward dramatically. And also so that you could use better structure, like the kind of structure in this kind of cross. It's scientifically and empirically more powerful than something like a Beng Chuan. But then you need to adapt your structure, and how do you do that? You've got to make the posture wider. How do you then account for the posture being wider, being more of a slip risk? Well, you change the way that you're stepping and you use this kind of compounded skip step. And we've learned that before where we were landing on the ball of the foot, but now we have to do the compounded skip step with the split harmony landing on a flatter part of the foot. It's still the ball of the foot, but then the heel is much closer when you land and then that just hits the floor. And you can see clearly from this still that to do that you have to lift your weight off the floor. So unlike Xing Yiquan, which very much relies on sink, in this posture you have to use rise. You've got to lift that weight up and then lift your feet off the floor, because if you scrape them on the floor it's too much of a stub risk. And then you've got to land with your weight partially forwards but not too much forwards. You've got to use the compression set from when the foot hits the floor and then the torso just kind of bounces forwards. It just bounces down, creates that compression set into the whole posture. So it's a very active and dramatic shift between rise and sink. And if you watch very carefully, you'll see that this isn't quite a split harmony. It still is a split harmony, but it's compounded with a pure harmony. It's so fast, it's so close to the step, it's so close to the set that you might call it a compound between split harmony and a perfect harmony. And it's a bit of a mind boggler for anyone, so good luck doing this. This will really help train these kinds of drills really help train your coordination. What's the timing, by the way? For me it's 1 and 2, 1 and 2, 1 and 2, 1 and 2, 1 and 2. Now, the next level is to compound it even further so that you make it completely a pure harmony. So look at this one. There's no split harmony. The fist and the punch land together, and that requires a higher level of coordination and skill. But look how wide the step is. You really need that to balance it and just to create the kind of structure for the landing. And even if you wouldn't necessarily do this posture, remember that's not what it's about. We're training our overall ability to use these advanced footwork concepts, and they will come into play with other techniques like kicks and elbows, things that might not be completely obvious at this stage. Now, look again at the use of the pivot root. We need this for lots of different things, but particularly look at the difference it makes in terms of reach. And this is critically important because we've foreshortened our step by compounding it. So we need to think about how can we maximize everything, make everything as structurally sympathetic as possible. So look at the posture and what it helps us do. Not only does it stabilize our landing, but it gives us this much extra reach if we just lift up onto that pivot root, and it makes the whole posture springier and more resilient. And from there, it's structurally sympathetic with pushing forward into the jump, or with another technique, for example, a kick or something like that. It can just spring straight up from there. And it can even be useful for going in for the shoot, for just springing forwards, just giving you that extra bit of momentum, that extra bit of ping, just to spring forwards and grab. Pivot roots for the win.